Thank you very much indeed, Mr Hanson, and to colleagues likewise. I beg to move that this House has considered the issue of abuse and intimidation of candidates and the public in UK elections. I should start by saying that since the election, the Conservatives Whip's office has been dealing with at least 3 credible threats to colleagues every week, including death threats, criminal damage, sexism, racism, homophobia, anti-Semitism and general thuggishness around and after the election. And for all I know, other parties of Whip's offices may be having very similar experiences. And I look forward to hearing some sort of cross-party contribution on that score. And it's for this reason, and a few others, that I thought it was appropriate to call this debate now. Because when I first started doing this and entered the House back 7 years ago, it never crossed my mind for 1 minute that I would end up making a speech like this. As far as I was concerned, elections were 4 or 5 weeks of robust banter, followed by a shake of the hand and a pint in the pub. And yet, 2 years on, it all seems so different. Swastikas on election boards, offensive slogans and language on posters. Of course, delighted.
I thank the honourable member for giving way and indeed for bringing this very important debate to this hall today. I've been an MP for just over 2 years and I can't remember a single day that has gone by without having received some sort of abuse, whether that be death threats or a picture of me being mocked up as a used sanitary towel and various other things. This last election was the most brutal I can certainly imagine. But does the honourable member agree that we have to look at this almost from a non-partisan view and accept that in all of our parties, as much as it hurts us, there are people who do not represent our values? And so for some to suggest it's only one party doing it is wrong.
Very grateful for the honourable lady's contribution. I absolutely recognise that, and I will be coming to it in my speech. There will, of course, be individual contributions, people who might have had one particular experience which defies that challenge, but I do agree with her, and I'm very grateful for raising it that early in the proceedings. I will. Of course I will. What do I want to talk about? Yeah.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way so early in his speech and congratulate him on securing this debate. And whilst I understand why he's brought this debate, particularly with regards to general elections, does he not agree with me that the recent research done by Radio 5 Live, BBC, which said that half of British female MPs have been threatened with physical abuse, 9 out of 10 have been abused online, and 80% have been verbally abused, shows that this isn't something that is only restricted to election time?
Again, a very timely contribution. I think one of the things which has struck me, and I know it struck people in our Whip's office too, when you start uncovering this kind of topic, you find out stuff that you simply didn't think existed. I have been astonished by the quantity of evidence from all sides that I've received in relation to this. And as the honourable lady rightly says, this is I assumed that it was something which might just be around election times when we are perhaps a higher profile community. Actually, it's not. Actually, it's something which seems to be going on all the time, and there are a number of colleagues who are suffering in silence, and I hope they don't have to suffer in silence as a consequence of that. But I should press on. I mentioned swastikas on election boards, offensive slogans and language on posters, scratched cars, broken windows, and posters of the bleeding head of some of our political leaders on stakes at marches and demos. Even the occasional police officer and teacher joining in the overall fray. Not the rule, but not the exception, but occasionally the rule. Retailers and hoteliers who feel they can't support a candidate publicly or make a donation to the party or candidate of their choice because they're worried they might get attacked on online review sites or, even worse, in person. Elderly voters who won't put up a sign in their windows. Volunteers who worry about handing out leaflets without having abuse hurled at them. Or a colleague whose sexuality or religion results in them being spat at, not once, but regularly. And I know we're going to hear more of that in a moment. These are people who form the core of democracy, the core of our election effort, and yet they are being steadily put off getting involved in politics at a time when their contribution has never been more important. And, of course, it's online too. We'll probably spend quite a bit of online. So for us, on our side of the House, I'm sure it's the same for colleagues from opposition parties too, hashtag Tory scum has been just a regular feature of our lives. But that's just a bit I can repeat in this chamber. I chose my words very carefully. And I don't know how many colleagues have read the report from BCS, the Chartered Institute for IT and Demos, who published a survey recently. In a 3-month period, MPs received 188,000 abusive tweets. That's in a 3-month period. That's 1 in 20 tweets received by colleagues. I heard a... Yes, of course, I'll give way. Yeah.
Thank the Honourable Member for giving way. The Honourable Member will be aware that legislation already exists to protect those who are abused online, but often this legislation is ignored or not enforced. Will the Honourable Member join me in putting pressure on the government to launch a review into seeing why this legislation is often ignored?
The Honourable Lady is psychic, amongst many other things. That was my next comment, and I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree with that. I think there's another element about the existing laws. It's actually how few people know that they exist. And indeed, in some of the sort of law enforcement agencies who don't know they exist either. And I think part of the question I should be putting to the Minister in a few minutes is to get a greater understanding of what legislation is there, what isn't, where the gaps are, and what we can do about filling those gaps. Yes, of course I will.
The Honourable Member might be aware of the Select Committee report, the Home Affairs Select Committee report last year that looked at online abuse that MPs have to suffer. And there was an issue about the threshold that we have to endure as Member of Parliament, which is different to members of the public. But if abuse is persistent and then falls over into real-life activities, surely social media companies also have to be held accountable too.
I'm sure a number of colleagues would agree with that contribution, and I certainly do, and I'm coming to some proposals and thoughts over social media in just a moment. I did want to just take 2 seconds to describe the example of, on our side of the House, our former colleague Baron Davis, until recently the MP for Gower. Now, during the election campaign, he was subject to a sustained attack on Twitter, which contained absolutely unfounded allegations about a criminal investigation for electoral fraud. This was not an embellishment of a story. This was not an exaggeration. This was simply made up. Now, this is a colleague, whether you support him or not, who was defending a majority of 27. And he had to do that against a constant drip feed on social media, people who were simply making it up as they went along. And could it have contributed to the loss of his seat? I don't know, but it certainly was blatant defamation, that much we do know. Now, the Electoral Commission couldn't help, social media platforms wouldn't help, and the police investigation, like all police investigations, takes its time and is grinding slowly on, but our former colleague, Mr Davis, is having to do all of that himself now, and he's bearing the cost for that. And when that inquiry eventually reaches its conclusion, what remedy will he really have? I could mention my right honourable friends from South East Cornwall, Ribble Valley, Plymouth Moor View, Edinburgh, Brigham Goole, Liverpool, Wavertree, and I'm sure many others who've suffered similar or vaguely intimidatory experiences during the election campaign. But almost more worrying that is the number of colleagues who I've spoken to in the last few days who do not even want to come to this chamber to make a contribution, lest it compound the intimidation and abuse that they've been receiving over those weeks. So I hope all of us in here are, in a sense, making our contributions not to ease our bruised egos, but actually on behalf of colleagues who have really put up with quite a lot of this nonsense over quite a long time and are looking, as the Honourable Lady opposite said, for a lead from government in this respect. So, having said all of that, I do want to make the point that this is not about thin-skinned politicians having had a bit of a bruising time and feeling rather sorry for ourselves. Nor is it actually, as the first intervention mentioned, something about left versus right, or right versus left, or whatever it might be. Although I thought the Honourable Lady, the member for Normanton, Pontefract and Castleford, made a very interesting contribution on that particular score in her speech to the Fabian Society at the weekend. This is actually about families, it's about staff, it's about helpers, it's about volunteers. It's about, for those of us who've got teenage children who might follow us on Twitter and Facebook, it's actually being able to explain to them that actually, don't worry about the death threat. threat. Don't worry about the abuse. Don't worry about the false accusations. It's for them that we speak to. And I wanted to raise another former colleague, Charlotte Leslie. Yes, of course. Yeah.
I thank you for giving way. I have had death threats for a number of years. I have panic buttons, a restraining order against somebody. What is different about what is happening at this election, in which I was subjected to anti-Semitic abuse, my staff were spat at, my boards and property were attacked, is it has been politically motivated. And the elephant in the room here is it is being motivated by the language of some of our political leaders when they accuse people of one political side of murder, when they dehumanise them in the way that is happening at the moment. There is something more sinister to this. And yes, it affects left and right, but we have to deal with this issue of what's happening at the other side of politics.
One of the most important recommendations I'm going to make, in my mind anyway, at the end of this contribution is the role of political leadership in this, and what political leaders need to do rather than what political leaders need to say. But I wanted to mention the example of our former colleague Charlotte Leslie in Bristol, whose parents became victims of this particular abuse. Their entire oil heating supply was drained into their garden by somebody who had an objection to Charlotte's particular position on fracking, which was a slightly ironic way of dealing with an environmental consideration. But nonetheless, it caused enormous distress, as did the scratching of Tory scum in her elderly parents' car. That is not something that anybody in this House should condone. And when it comes to political leadership, as my honourable friend has just pointed out, it is exactly that example that we think should trigger a robust response from everybody who has the benefit of a high profile in politics. So it's about religion, it's about sexuality, it's about social background, it's for people who might have been to public school and sound a bit posh. It's about anybody who might have a political leaning one way or the other, who might be thinking of perhaps becoming a local councillor, who might be thinking of maybe a career in some future stage in some branch of politics, not even necessarily as an MP or an Assembly member or whatever, or a member of the Scottish Parliament, whatever it might be. And we have to ask ourselves the question that, why would I? Why would I want to take that step when you see what members of this House have to put up with, and worse still, as I said, what members of this House's families, friends, relations, campaigners, donors also have to subject themselves to? So my question to the social media platforms and to the left and to the right and to groups like Momentum who've been mentioned during this is actually, rather than us simply take the lazy way out and say it's them who's responsible for this, help us. If you are on the left, help us. If you are on the right, help us. If you are a social media platform, help us. Identify what has triggered the increase in abuse. The smear campaigns, the intimidation, the harassment, the thuggish behaviour, online and offline, and the general criticism of people simply because you can't match or contest their arguments. Yes, of course.
I'm grateful to him for giving way. And he's quite right. This behaviour is reprehensible, and he is right to identify social media. But does he also think there's a role maybe for the traditional print media, and particularly some of the newspapers like Sun, for creating a climate in which it's okay to abuse politicians? And maybe, we need to look at the traditional print media as well for creating that.
Well, Honourable Gentleman makes an interesting point. Of course, print media is, of course, governed by maybe a rather different and more visible level of regulation. I think there is a line between robust challenge, the cut and thrust of politics, the sort of stuff we know when we take on this job that we're letting ourselves in for. And some papers would argue that they're the right side of that line. I think that is a mile away from some of the stuff that we are talking about here. And I think people being made to feel a little bit shamefaced or guilty because they've cocked up their particular contribution to politics, if I can use that expression, that's one thing. That's one thing. But actually, if there is a single example of a newspaper which incites racial hatred, anti-Semitism, all that sort of thing, then that, I think, is an interesting point which the regulators ought to be looking at without, of course, impinging on free speech. I will again, yes.
You're making it a very strong case, and I am a little bit concerned that this debate might blur the lines between criticism of a performance of a Member of Parliament or a stance they take to actual abuse. My concern is it stops women especially, entering politics. And I can very briefly give an example of a candidate who unfortunately wasn't elected, who stood in Ealing, and because members of Parliament have to declare their addresses when they stand in Parliament, she said she started becoming nervous when she noticed activity during the election campaign by the opponents, when they started standing outside my door at my home, spitting in my face and following me. And that's the threatening behaviour she wants to highlight. It's not about criticism in the press.
Grateful for my honourable friend's contribution. There is, of course, legislation which already exists to deal with incidents that the honourable lady describes. But as we've touched on before, it's not always easily accessible. It's not always entirely advantageous during an election campaign to be distracted by that. But the point absolutely with pleasure.
I thank the gentleman for giving way. We've been sparring partners on many occasions, but on this one, I congratulate the member for raising the issue and agree with him that all it takes for evil to prosper is for good people to do nothing.
Yeah.
On the other hand, it's very easy for us in this place to make the case and put the arguments down. We are protected by privilege and other. We have the means of putting our views on this on the record. But there are councillors and ordinary people out there volunteering for political parties and charities up and down the country who are not protected in anything like the same way as we are in Parliament.
Very grateful for the honourable lady's contribution, and that absolutely touches on the reason that I think we're here, is because there is a degree of collateral impact as a result of what we may fairly visibly suffer from, and the knock-on effect that has on people who want to do good things for their community or their charity or their cause, but are beginning to just ask themselves the question as to whether it's worth the effort. And I want to ask the Minister in a minute what plans the government may have to at least assess the extent of that, because I don't think any of us here actually know what it is. And I wanted to point out that the age, it seems, of reasoned argument in elections seems to be almost under threat. And I think all of us, in our own particular way, have experienced situations where you mention immigration and you're instantly labelled a racist. You mention welfare and you were instantly labelled as having some extraordinary dislike of the disabled. You want to talk about complicated and sensitive issues around the economy, and yet that's interpreted as simply wanting to starve the poor, or absurd, extreme, ridiculous, lazy, trite comments which are assigned to members of this House who simply want to tackle a complicated social problem in the way that we were sent here to do. And the fact that there is no room for reasoned argument anymore is a consequence, and perhaps even a cause, of this debate in the first place. And it seems that it's not really about winning votes anymore. It's not about winning arguments. Some of the manner in which these campaigns are being conducted, and I'm trying to obviously steer a very careful non-partisan line here, it's about driving people out of politics altogether. So it's not about votes and arguments. It's about this single-minded determination to do away with anybody who happens to hold a contrary view. And that's a big difference between 2015 and 2017. And it's an unattractive development which will simply reduce the gene pool from which we recruit our politicians and our volunteers. And I can't believe there's any member of the public, however vociferous that they may be online, who actually thinks reducing the number of people from which we choose our representatives is a good thing. So what's all this doing to society? How's it impacting on candidate recruitment? What's it doing about retaining good people in this House? Have we reviewed the Law Commission's recommendations made 18 months ago? I'm hopeful that the Minister will have some views on this. Are we doing enough about bringing the existing provisions to the knowledge of the enforcement agencies and indeed to candidates? So I hope when the Minister gets to his feet in a few minutes, he will be able to give us some indication as to what the government's view is with regard to an independent assessment of the extent of the problem. What is going on out there? What's the cause? What's the remedy? Of course, I give way to honourable gentlemen.
4 years ago, the All-Party Group of Anti-Semitism produced a very detailed set of recommendations on an all-party basis on electoral on conduct in elections, and we asked every political leader to endorse it. To date, none have. Does he agree with me that if the political leaders drew up themselves a code of conduct and a way of addressing behaviour during elections, that would go a considerable way in the election period to dealing with what is the most difficult period, because anyone who transgresses, or their supporters do, faces the issue of votes at that time, and therefore there's a tendency to try and dampen down and ignore during elections, precisely why we did that report.
Yeah, Honourable Gentleman, absolutely. I couldn't have put it better myself. In fact, I would expand it to outside election times too, because I think that we've heard today that this isn't a problem which is unique to that 4 or 5 week period once every 3 or 4 years. So my second question to the Minister is about reviewing existing laws, seeing which ones work, seeing which ones should work but aren't being enforced, seeing where there are gaps and recommending how those gaps are filled. And then, as the Honourable Gentleman said, ensuring that there is cross-party support in this place when it comes to passing legislation to achieve that aim. And then, of course, we need to look at the responsibilities of the social media platforms, who all too often, as the Honourable Lady from Andover and I discovered not that long ago, all too often wring their hands and say it's all too difficult. Well, actually, it isn't all too difficult. It's all too important now that they adopt the same responsible attitude to what they publish in their name, although they deny that they are publishers. But what goes out in their name is, on occasions, the sort of material which is completely unacceptable. And the example I gave earlier on of Byron Davis and the Gower, who made an approach to a social media platform to ask them, Twitter I think it was, to remove an outright lie which was possibly going to affect the outcome of the election. They refused. They didn't even, it wasn't a case of, they refused. They said what was going on was within guidelines. It cannot be within guidelines. It cannot be within guidelines to simply sit back and allow people to publish utter nonsense in order to artificially disrupt the outcome of an election. I suspect everybody in this chamber is of that view. And when the Minister responded to a debate, then Minister, I should say, on online bullying last year, he said there needs to be a partnership, and I do not rule out regulation. We need to work with the companies, and we need clear guidelines on definitions of online abuse. Even more importantly, we need very quick reactions so that all of us as constituency MPs do not have to sit in surgeries with people who are clearly, utterly distressed because of online material. And so it went on. That applies just as much to electoral behaviour as it does to behaviour outside that time. And finally, Mr Hanson, thank you for your patience. We need the political lead that other colleagues have mentioned. That means leaders of all parties and all groups. They need to stand up and not just send out warmly worded tweets about bad behaviour or transmit mealy-mouthed messages of condemnation. It actually means a not-in-my-name approach. It means all of the groups that we've talked about, overtly and by insinuation, need to say, not in my name. If anybody who is a member of this party or this group engages in online or offline abuse, either during an election or indeed any other time, the leadership of those organisations, they have the opportunity today to stand up and say, actually, we will deal with this and we will deal with it robustly. Because if they don't, they are complicit in the problem. And that, I think, has been why rumours and this whole thing has gathered momentum with small m over the last few months and years. Because, Mr Hanson, we are 14 months or so. It was 14 months or so ago that our colleague Joe Cox paid the ultimate price for this kind of stuff. And it shook the nation and it sent a message that I thought and hoped that people would listen to, whether they are in a position of political leadership or indeed just able to vote at elections. But it seems 1 year on that the problem is every bit as bad as it was back then. And unless we get joined up cooperative leadership from the government, which I hope we'll hear now, and of course from the opposition parties, all of them, and the groups who support them, then all of the extraordinary work that has been done in Jo Cox's memory will have been wasted. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered abuse and intimidation of candidates and the public in UK elections. I intend to call the front bench spokesperson from the Scottish National Party at 5:10. So there is very limited time for contributions from honourable and right honourable members. So I do hope people can bear that in mind, although I won't be able to get everybody in. And if people could stand again, I could see who wishes to. So I'll call Diane Abbott.
Thanks very much, Mr. Hanson. This is a very important debate, and I congratulate the honourable gentleman for obtaining it. But we have to be clear. We are not talking here about robust debate, however robust it is. We are talking about mindless abuse. And in my case, the mindless abuse has been characteristically racist and sexist. And just to outline, I've had death threats. I've had people tweeting that I should be hung if, quotes, they could find a tree big enough to take the fat bitch's weight. There was an EDL-affiliated Twitter account, #burn Diane Abbott. I've had rape threats, described as a pathetic, useless, fat, black piece of shit, ugly, fat, black bitch, and nigger. Nigger over and over again. And one of my members of staff said that when people ask her, what is the most surprising thing about coming to work for me? The most surprising thing for her is how often she has to read the word nigger. And this comes in through emails, through Twitter, through Facebook. But where I disagree with the honourable gentleman, he seems to suggest that this is all a relatively recent thing around the time of this election. That's not my experience. That really is not my experience. It is certainly true that online abuse, the online abuse that I experience and others experience, has got worse in recent years, and it does get worse at election time. But I don't put it down to a particular election. I think the rise in the use of online has turbocharged abuse. Because, 30 years ago, when I first became an MP, if you wanted to attack an MP, you had to write a letter, usually in green ink, you had to put it in an envelope, you had to put a stamp on it, and you had to walk to the post box. Now they press a button and you read vile abuse, which 30 years ago people would have been frightened to even write down. So I accept that male politicians get abused too. But I hope the one thing we can agree on in this chamber is that it is much worse for women. Absolutely. And I think as well as the rise of online, anonymity is the thing. People would not come up to me and attack me for being a nigger in public. But they'll do it online. And I'm telling you, this isn't once a week. This isn't during an election. This is every day. My staff switch on the computer, they go onto Facebook, they go onto Twitter, and they see this stuff. Okay.
Everything the Honourable Lady said, I agree with. I don't think my Honourable friend was saying that this is a new thing. We've all had it for years on social media, and she's had it in a particularly terrible way. I think what's different now is how some of this has been driven by the language of political leaders. When you address a rally with posters of the severed head of the Prime Minister and don't do anything about it, and when leaders say, ditch the bitch in relation to the Prime Minister, this is the problem we have at the moment with this dehumanisation of each other in politics.
We will have to agree to disagree. We'll have to agree to disagree. The type of racist and sexist abuse, I'm afraid I can't give way because I'm mindful of the time. The type of racist and sexist abuse I get is not tied to any events in this particular election campaign. The other thing I should say, because I'm mindful of the time, this is not just about politicians. It's not even about just women politicians. Any woman that goes into the public space can expect this type of abuse. People will remember how Mary Beard, the historian, had horrible abuse online because she was on Question Time.
The Honourable Lady was making a very powerful speech, but I'm conscious we only have 11 minutes to get other members in. I wish you'd draw your remarks to a conclusion.
So in closing, I'd like to say three things. First, there is a relationship between online abuse and mainstream media commentary. At the very least, we always see, my office, a spike in abuse after there's been a lot of negative stuff in the media. Online abuse and abuse generally is not the preserve of any party or of any faction of any party. And to pretend that devalues a very important argument. Yeah. So I'm glad we've had this debate. It gives me no pleasure to talk about what I've experienced, not during the last election, but for years. But let's get this debate straight. It's not about a particular party. It's not about a particular faction. It's about the degradation of public discourse online.
On securing this debate. I've stood in 6 general elections now, and I can say, frankly, that this was, by a long chalk, the most unpleasant election I've ever participated in. I have no doubt at all that much of the behaviour that my honourable friend outlined just now was coordinated, because the patterns of behaviour that I witnessed in my own constituency have been repeated right across the country and have been reported to me by a number of colleagues here. One point I wish to raise, and really to echo what the Right Honourable Lady for Hackney mentioned, and that is the issue of social media. And frankly, if ever there were a misnomer, social media is it. It is deeply anti-social media. Twitter in particular, I believe, has a lot to answer for. The anonymity with which a lot of participants on Twitter clothe themselves encourages the sort of behaviour that we've heard today. I mean, frankly, logging onto Twitter nowadays is very much like wading through sewage. It's a deeply unpleasant experience. And the sort of commentary that one sees on Twitter, the sort of abuse, the sort of language that is regularly used towards everybody, but in particular to candidates for election, is the sort of thing that no one would dream of saying to another person face to face. Now, this, I believe, is the nub of the issue. We have now got this new phenomenon of social media, which I don't believe has been adequately addressed. It's certainly not being addressed by the social media companies. My honourable friend is right. If you try to make a complaint to Twitter, you get completely ignored. Twitter, in fact, has a huge amount to answer for. So in the brief time available to me, what I would ask the Minister is this. Would he please give consideration to the sort of impact that social media has had on the behaviour of many people during this election campaign? And perhaps he could also say what proposals the government have got to address that. Because at the moment, we are seeing this anarchic media, which are, frankly, causing misery to untold numbers of people, not least colleagues here in this House.
Dr. Lisa Cameron.
And it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today, Mr Hanson, and I'd like to thank the honourable member for bringing this extremely important debate. I'm very sorry we are having to have this debate, but it is necessary, and I've already been appalled today by the severity and of the scale of the abuse that has been described that honourable members have experienced. In our democracy, being able to stand for Parliament free from abuse, from threats, from degradation and defamatory remarks is absolutely essential. I've always thought we should encourage non-career politicians into politics. Career politicians are also very good, but we need that diversity. But it's very difficult to encourage non-career politicians into a world of negativity, put-downs, vilification and abuse. Parliament will be losing good people. All parties, I'm sure, have these issues, and I would reiterate that I think it's incumbent upon party leaders to act where this is occurring. We cannot ignore abuse, because ignoring abuse condones it, ultimately. In terms of my own experience, I had very personal attacks. I have experienced anti-Semitic comments, having friends and family who are Jewish. I have met constituents who said they were told that I was not a real doctor and that I was pretending and masquerading to be a doctor, that I didn't live with my husband, all sorts of false allegations that I had business contracts with the NHS, which I have never had. Once again, this was aimed at undermining my credibility personally and professionally. I'd just like to end and give others the opportunity to contribute, because where this occurs, I think it's incumbent upon candidates and parties to act and party leaders to act. It doesn't benefit politics, society, and it doesn't benefit diversity. So I'd be obliged for the Minister to respond, and hopefully we'll have cross-party consensus on this issue at least.
Well done. Andrew Percy.
Thank you, Mr. Hanson. I'll try to do a couple of interventions. Look, I'm a Tory in Humberside. It's not an easy place to be a Tory. I was a councillor for 10 years, one of 2 on Hull City Council, 4 council elections, 4 general elections. I'm not afraid of abuse. I'm not afraid of insults. And it's something I'm pretty used to. But what's happening now, Mr. Hanson, is on a different scale. I've been called Tory scum for years, and I've been pretty much used to that and had insults in the street. That's part of the process. You might say it shouldn't be. It has been. What happened this election was different, though, Mr. Hanson. I never thought in my own constituency somebody would come up to me and start shouting the name of the leader of the opposition and then describe me as Israeli and Zionist scum. I never thought that my posters would be ripped down, posted on social media under the phrase, "Fuck the Tories, #Corbyn in." I never thought my staff would be spat at in the street by activists, by people naming the leader of the opposition as their motivation for calling my staff Tory fucking scum. That's what's happening in our democracy, Mr. Hanson. And it is true that there is abuse on all sides. There's abuse on the left and there's abuse on the right. And I condemn it absolutely. What is different about what is happening now is there is an assault on our democracy. There is an assault on one particular political party. And it is being motivated, in this case, this dehumanisation of this side of politics, it is being motivated and it is being encouraged by the language of some of the leaders of that party. And they were really decent Labour members, really decent Labour members, the vast mass of them, members of Parliament. And it's been happening to them as well by some of these individuals, Mr. Hanson. But to have leaders, as I said, addressing rallies with the severed head of the Prime Minister and it not be called out, to have leaders accusing people of murder, and to have leaders saying ditch the bitch and it not being called out, this is an assault. This is an assault on our democratic values and on our process. And it has to stop, Mr. Hanson. This is the worst I've ever encountered in any election. And it's not acceptable. And it is primarily, in this particular regard, coming from one particular faction. And we should be honest about it. We should be honest about it.
Luke Pollard and Raymond Shishti with literally 3 minutes. So Luke Pollard for about a minute and a half maximum.
Thank you. I'd like to say that abuse aimed at candidates, volunteers, is not something endured by only one party. It's enjoyed by all parties. And that there are people right across our political spectrum, from left to right, in the middle, who suffer needless abuse by trying to make the world a better place. Politics is our way of doing that. It is a difficult, contested environment. And at elections, we want our debates to be robust. But speaking as a gay man and a proud Janner from Plymouth, I want to speak up not just for people like sitting in this chamber here, the members of Parliament, but for the volunteers, for people who are cautious about getting involved with politics for the first time. I've spoken to a young LGBT person during the election who said, I get abuse online, I'm scared to go online. If members of Parliament aren't getting justice for the abuse they're getting, what chance do I have? And I think the message that this House and the government must send to those young people from the LGBT community, from every community, who want to make the world a better place, is that abuse will be taken seriously, wherever it comes from, whoever says it, whatever form it is done in, whether that's in the mainstream print media, on slipped into broadcast, on social media, on abuse on posters, or as Jemima in Plymouth, one of the people I represent, had anonymous notes put through her door simply because she put a Labour poster up. We've got to send that message that abuse, wherever it comes from, is not acceptable.
Absolutely. Well said.
Pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I congratulate the Honourable Member for Carmarthenshire for bringing forward this debate. And can I just say this at the very outset? I have colleagues on all sides of this House. In my 7 years, I've built some wonderful friendships, gone on some wonderful trips abroad on our delegations and the work that we have carried out together. But what is unacceptable to happen to any Member of Parliament from any political party, I will never accept it. And let me give you 2 examples, Mr. Hanson. When I stand up to make my acceptance speech after a very difficult election, and I have to say the culture in this election campaign was one of the most difficult I experienced. So when I stand up to make my acceptance speech, to thank all the electorate, to have an activist in public say, fuck off back to country X, and the matter is then referred to Kent Police, and they are investigating it under the public order and racism. So let them do their job. But in public, a Labour Party activist who happens to be a former group assistant to the Medway Labour Group says that in public, as you're making your acceptance speech, I ask each and every one of you, if you experience that, how would you feel? Point number 2, Mr. Hanson. Point number 2, a video goes online 2 days before the election, and it's a conversation between a third party to a Labour councillor who happens to be the former chairman of the Gillingham and Rainham Association, malicious, grossly offensive remarks being made, and a threat to me being made.
Order. I apologise, honourable gentleman. I have to call the front benches. Apologies. Be resume your seat. Apologies. Tommy Shepherd.
Thank you, Mr. Hanson. I appreciate we're short of time, and I know also that we're going to be discussing this again in the main chamber next week, so I'm going to try and keep my remarks very brief. I want to congratulate the member for bringing this debate. I think it is a very important one that we should have, and I want to associate my party with the sentiments that he's expressed in his opening remarks. I and many of my colleagues have been subject to exactly the type of activity that you describe. Indeed, someone was recently convicted for a threat that they made against me personally. I'm also extremely concerned, as others have remarked, at the way in which it does seem that the majority of perpetrators of this abuse seem to be male, and the majority of the targets, or at least the intensity of the targets, is much more directed towards female members, and I think that should be a cause for extreme concern by everyone. I also think we should be absolutely clear that we are not talking here about a bit of political banter. We're not talking about the rough and tumble of political debate or even satirising or caricaturing another person's point of view. We are talking about vile abuse, dehumanising people, offering and inciting sometimes violence against people. And this is the sort of activity which should not be deemed acceptable in any democratic society. I think we should also make the case that we are not suggesting, I hope, that there is anything special that needs to be protected about members of Parliament. We are arguing about a level of abuse that should be tackled no matter who in society suffers from it. In that sense, I do agree with the remarks made for the honourable member from Hackney North and Stoke Newington, which is I do think this cannot be taken in isolation from the general debates in society and the general media portrayals of certain people in society. And I'm not going to say exactly what the link is, but I think to say that there's not an association and there's not a link would be extremely problematic. I think we're very short of time. If you don't, well, quickly.
Thank you for giving way. Would you agree with the senior SNP politician that now is the time for a code of conduct that people can sign up to, and now is the time to ban anonymous social media accounts?
Yes, I would. I think you're talking about my colleague Alan Smith, MEP, who's a member of our National Executive, who's called for that. I was going to deal with that at the end of my remarks. I also wanted to point out that I think we need to consider the wider political factors that are at play here, and maybe if there's anything we can do to try and change the political discourse in our country by how we operate politics. And we have a special responsibility, I think, as elected members of Parliament to take a lead in that. I think it is the case, undoubtedly, that there are a lot of people who have got a legitimate sense of grievance about the lot that they have received in society for one reason or another, and they feel alienated from the political process and unable to express their point of view. Now, of course, that's always been the case. The difference today is that whereas those people had to go to extreme lengths to vent their anger before, now it is remarkably easy. Now all they need to do is to switch on their phone, and they can instantly, anonymously direct the most vile abuse to whomever they want. And I think but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't look at the underlying reason for that alienation, that disaffection that is there, and see if there is stuff we can do through our education system, through improving political discourse generally, to try and minimise that. Now, I don't say this to excuse the behaviour in any way. I'm simply trying to find some explanation for it, and so that we might begin the long-term process of trying to prevent it. I want to end with 2 points, Mr Hanson. One is to say that I would caution colleagues very much against trying to make this a party political matter. Every member of this House has been subject to some sort of abuse of this nature, some much more than others, but it crosses all political parties. And it isn't a matter that one political party is experiencing this more than any others. So I really do think that, I can understand how it is the case that sometimes people who offer this abuse will identify themselves as being a political opponent or supporting a political opponent of the person to whom the abuse is offered. But that doesn't mean that this is sanctioned by that political party. That doesn't mean that they speak for that political party. And therefore, I think that if we are to try and tackle this properly, we should do so on a cross-party basis. And I finish, Mr Hanson, by saying, yes, I think one of the things we certainly could do is agree a voluntary code of conduct between the political parties as to what is acceptable and what is not.
Thank you, Mr Hanson. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. And I'd like to thank the honourable member for bringing this important debate to the House. It's clearly one in which every member of the House has some interest, because I doubt there is any member of this House or who stood for election to this House who hasn't faced some level of abuse. And I'd like to thank members who took part, and certainly where examples of abuse were raised where that was done in the name of my party, I will be keen to know more details and happy to take up those cases. Now, I'm aware there are many members, Mr Hanson, who are not taking part in today's debate because they do not want to give oxygen or attention to those people who abuse them. And for that reason, I don't want to go into the details of abuse that I've received over the past couple of elections or years when I've been in the public eye. But I must stress that this abuse has no place in our democracy. If we are truly to be a country which has free and fair elections, then everybody must feel able to stand as a candidate or support a candidate or political party without fear. There's been a lot said about ourselves as politicians in this debate, but I would like to stress that this is also about people who purport to support a political party. And having spoken to my honourable friend for Barrow and Furness, he's told me that supporters of his who put up Vote Labour posters in our windows were subjected to hate mail, which is currently being investigated very seriously by the police because of the content of that hate mail. And it was alarming because, of course, this is not just for one political party. This is something which is happening across the political spectrum. And I think that this issue was first brought to this House at the first Prime Minister's questions of this session, when the member for South East Cornwall spoke about the abuse that she'd received during the election. And that is abhorrent too. So we know it's an issue for all political parties, but it's also an issue both during election time and outside of election time too. And whilst we serve as members in this House, we are afforded some level of security since the murder of Joe Cox. That security has been very much brought to our attention about how important that is. But it also reminds us about how serious this can be, because the abuse that happens online doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens because when someone can go online and they can tweet some abuse or put a Facebook message up there saying they want to, and I quote an example of one, put a bullet between his ears, and that was a comment I reported to Facebook, and they said it did not breach their terms and conditions. When people get away with doing that, it gives them the confidence to do it offline too and on the street. I'm obviously very hurt when I'm the victim of the abuse, but what hurts me far more, Mr Hanson, is when it's members of my staff who are abused in the street and often, occasionally, even mistaken to be me, which just makes me feel terribly guilty. So it's not just about the protection of politicians, but of their family and their colleagues. I give way to the Honourable Lady.
Sorry for interrupting the Honourable Lady, but does she not think that the leadership of our parties has to set the right tone? And if they don't, then people will follow that example. Surely she agrees with that.
The Honourable Lady may, has preempted my moving of my speech towards exactly that point, and that is about political leadership. I think it's important that political parties and political leaders have a way in which they can address this. And in the Labour Party, we have now a social media policy as well as a code of conduct that we expect our members to abide by. And where we find examples where members have not abided by that, we will not hesitate to remove them as members. And the pledge that our members make when they join the party is that they will not use any form of abuse, and that if they do, they will be risking losing their Labour Party membership. In fact, during in 2016, the Leader of the Opposition, my honourable friend Islington North, tweeted saying that this abuse was not acceptable. It's something he reiterated again in the question time debates during the general elections. But I think that I can't really, the time is really, really short. I want to just stress the responsibility for social media as well. Because as my honourable friend for Hampstead and Kilburn made the point on the Politics show yesterday, it's not right that Facebook can remove a picture of a woman breastfeeding within minutes, but it takes 2 weeks for them to remove a fake social media profile. And Mr Hanson, you were urging me to draw my remarks to a close. So I would like to urge the Minister to work on a cross-party basis. We would like to see a code of conduct by which we can work together to ensure that this abuse is not accepted. Thank you.
The honourable gentleman will get a chance to wind up at the end for 1 minute. Chris Skidmore.
Thank you, Mr Hanson. I congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Carmarthen West and South Pembrokeshire, on securing this important debate. And I welcome the opportunity to address some of the issues that he and other honourable members from across all sides of the House have raised. My honourable friend has put his points across in very powerful terms, and as have others today. And clearly this is an extremely serious matter which members on all sides feel strongly about. As he said in his opening remarks, this is not just about ourselves as members of Parliament. It is about all those close to us, our family, our friends and our supporters. And the Prime Minister has been very clear that there is no place in our democracy for the harassment of parliamentary candidates, and that abuse will not be tolerated. And that is why she has today asked the non-partisan Committee on Standards in Public Life to carry out a review of the intimidation experienced by parliamentary candidates, including those who stood to become members of Parliament at the 2017 general election. The review will gather evidence of harassment and consider what action needs to be taken to ensure the integrity of the future of our democratic process. This is clearly an issue that has the potential to impact upon people's wish to stand for office, and therefore has a negative impact on standards in public life more broadly. It is also about protecting the integrity of public service itself and the integrity of the offices that we hold. The independent and, as I say, non-partisan Committee on Standards in Public Life is well respected and, I believe, well placed to lead this work. It has conducted many detailed reviews on conduct and ethics and operates independently from government, regulators and politicians. Yes.
Giving way. When he says responsibility in relation to conduct, does he then agree with me, the point I was making earlier? If a third party makes to somebody in office a threat of violence towards another person running for office, in this case myself, and points out which are grossly offensive and anti-Semitic and homophobic, that individual to whom it is reported to has a responsibility to notify the authorities, because to do nothing, as the Honourable Lady opposite said, is completely unacceptable.
I entirely agree that we, as all legislators, cannot be silent on this issue, and I hope that all members going forward, as the committee begins to set up its review, will wish to partake some of the evidence that they have given today, and to be able to do so confidentially without risk of somehow glorifying the perpetrators. It will be for the committee to determine the exact parameter of the review, but we anticipate that they will want to examine the nature of the problem, the protections and measures that are currently in place, and if these need to change. The committee may also consider the broader implication for other office holders, and the role of councillors was mentioned. Foremost, the review will look at intimidation experienced by anyone who has stood as a parliamentary candidate, and I'm sure the committee will want to progress this work as quickly as possible, and the committee will produce a report for the Prime Minister with specific recommendations for actions, and we look forward to the committee's findings. Now, turning to the question of abuse and the parameters of legislation currently, as was pointed out, legislation is in place to deal with internet trolls, cyber stalking and harassment, and perpetrators of grossly offensive, obscene or menacing behaviour. And as a government, we're making changes where necessary to ensure that the legislation we have is as effective as possible. For example, in the Criminal Justice and Courts Act 2015, we made changes to relevant offences to help ensure that people who commit them are prosecuted and properly punished. The 2015 Act amended Section 1 of the Malicious Communications Act 1988, which makes an offence to send certain articles with intent to cause distress or anxiety. The amendment allows for prosecutions to be dealt with either in the Magistrates' Court or the Crown Court, with the maximum penalty for this offence in the Magistrates' Court is 12 months imprisonment and 2 years for the Crown Court. The amendment also removed the previous requirement of prosecution be brought in within 6 months, so that changes made by the Act also extended the time within which prosecutions for offences under Section 127 of the Communications Act 2003 be brought up to 3 years after the offence. The key point has been made. Legislation is in place. It is about communicating the fact that the legislation now needs to be used by the police when offences and claims and accusations of those offences are brought to them. The law is clear that what is illegal offline is also illegal online. Robust legislation is in place to deal with internet trolls and cyber stalking and harassment and the perpetrators of that grossly offensive, obscene or menacing behaviour. Section 127 of the existing Communications Act 2003 created an offence of sending or causing to be sent by means of a public electronic communications network a message or other matter that is grossly offensive or of an indecent, obscene or menacing character. And the Crown Prosecution Service also recently revised its guidelines on social media to incorporate new and emerging crimes that are being committed online and to provide clear advice to help the prosecution of cyber-enabled crime. The recently enacted Digital Economy Act will also help, I believe, to ensure that online abuse is more effectively tackled by requiring a code of practice to be established. The code will set out guidance about what social media providers should do in relation to conduct on their platforms and involves bullying or insulting an individual or other behaviour likely to intimidate or humiliate them. Government is considering how to take forward the Social Media Code of Practice as part of the newly established Digital Charter, and we will provide more details about when the consultation with social media will take place shortly. Hate crime of any kind, directed against any community or any person, has absolutely no place in our society. I'm sure we can all agree this. We, as a government, are utterly committed to tackling hate crime. The Prime Minister has made it very clear that hate crime of any kind is completely unacceptable. It divides communities, it destroys lives, and it makes us weaker. Britain is thriving precisely because we welcome people from all backgrounds, from all faiths and ethnicities, and that is something that we must strive to protect. The fact that one of the first actions the current Home Secretary took in her new role last summer was to launch the Hate Crime Action Plan shows how important that we believe tackling hate crime is to the government. And the Home Secretary has also asked Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary to carry out an inspection of all 5 monitored strands of hate crime, to build up a national picture of how effectively and efficiently police forces are actually dealing with hate crime. The inspection will take place during 2017-18, and the Government will be keen to see what findings there are from this inspection, and then to consider how these should be taken forward. The Government is determined that no candidate, regardless of their party, regardless of their background, regardless of their race, their ethnicity, or their sexuality, should be forced to tolerate abuse. On or offline, physical abuse or the threat of violence or intimidation. It is utterly unacceptable in our modern democracy, which we believe is an inclusive and tolerant democracy, that these incidents of abuse that have been discussed today can be allowed to go on unchallenged. I've personally met last week with the Electoral Commission, the Law Commission this week, to raise the issue with the Electoral Commission of candidate abuse, and I look forward to the Committee on Standards in Public Life, review of intimidation experienced by parliamentary candidates, and the eventual conclusions of their report. We, as members of Parliament, as the Government, cannot be silent on this matter. The law exists to protect candidates, and I would urge anyone who has evidence of abuse to present it to the committee as part of their review, to the Electoral Commission as part of their own review process into the general election, and above all to their local police force, who must take this issue very seriously. I would like to thank members from all sides for contributing to this important debate today, which I hope will mark a turning point that will not only assist increased detection and tolerance of abuse of all forms, but will mark a cultural shift where we, across all parties, can work together to stamp out these vile forms of abuse, tackling the fundamental point that this is not acceptable or permissible. We owe it to our democracy to make clear that intimidation and abuse has no part in our society, not only for candidates who stood at this recent general election, but for future generations of men and women considering entering public life and standing for election. No one must be deterred from playing their part in our democracy, which is why we must seek to end the corrosive effect abuse and intimidation has on actively discouraging future generations from standing as our future representatives.
For your role this afternoon, to colleagues from all sides of the House for such useful contributions, to the Government for taking such immediate action on this. We even got a letter from the Prime Minister before the Minister had got to his feet. So things are working well. My apologies for going on too long at the beginning, particularly to my honourable friend from Gillingham and Raynham, who was, I thought, making a really moving speech. And I hope he will have an opportunity, perhaps in the other chamber, to complete those comments. And if I had a chance to intervene on the front bench spokesman, it would have been to ask how many people the Labour Party has actually sanctioned already for offences in this particular area. And perhaps you could write to me with that information. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, the question is that this House has considered abuse and intimidation of candidates and the public in UK elections. And many of that opinion say aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.